Welcome to Live with the Author. We have a special episode today where we're going to be interviewing one of our special issue authors, Devin Kearns. Welcome, Devin.
Thanks, Amanda. Good to see you.
So good to see you as well. And by the way, I'm Amanda Goodwin, and I'm one of the co-editors of Reading Research Quarterly. And Devin's an author for our special issue on the science of reading. And as you all know, we tackled the science of reading to really try to get a more accurate vision of what the science of reading was, to bridge perspectives and to push the field forward. And Devin's piece, I'm happy to report, really pushed my thinking. So I'm excited to share and think about what his piece with him. So his piece, by the way, if you're trying to find it, is Does English Have Useful Syllable Division Patterns? And it's in our first special issue. And so Devin, talk to me a little bit about how you came to get interested in this work.
So I was a reading remediation specialist. I worked at a clinic for kids with dyslexia. And one of the things we were asked to do was to teach kids how to break words into syllables, following what we call rules, right? Pattern is probably a better descriptor since there are clearly no complete rules. But we were taught to use these rules. And I had never learned about this when I got my initial teaching in reading. And I was immediately like, why did no one explain to me that, like, in the word razor, if you break it after the A, like the A says the long sound, and this is really fantastic, and I'm going to teach kids this, and they're going to learn a lot. And so that was my immediate reaction. I was like upset that no one taught it to me. It's actually one of the reasons I do this job, was like I wanted to teach people about these things that I felt like the world was missing. But as I continued on in my career, you know, both as a teacher and then as a researcher, it became clear to me that, like, the rules don't work, especially that vowel consonant vowel pattern, like where the first vowel is supposed to say the long sound, don't seem to work all the time. You've got dragon and you've got linen and you've got, you know, a variety of words like this where that first vowel says the short sound when it should say the long sound. And I started thinking, how common is it that the words don't follow the rules?
I love that. I used to, when I was teaching, I used to have a jail on my bulletin board, and the words would go to jail when they were the rule breakers. And I noticed it too. Jail filled up really fast. There were a lot of rule breakers out there.
A lot of rule breakers, totally, yeah. On all, you know, on all levels, like, of course, but yeah, with this one in particular, I just thought, how useful is this information? So
cool. So Devin, as you know, people have lots of different images or lots of different definitions of the science of reading. What is the science of reading to you?
The science of reading is a sort of a collection of scientific data about how reading works, both neuroscientifically, cognitively, behaviorally, and how we support students who have, well, how we teach students to read to begin with, and then how we teach students who have reading difficulty. And in both cases, what do we know from scientific data about how reading works and about how to help kids read?
So I'm hearing from you sort of two parts and broad, right? So it seemed like you came from lots of different domains, but it's also how kids read, but also how do we teach that reading?
Yep.
Cool. Well, how does your article add to this science of reading, body of knowledge?
Yeah. So I think this article is more about the how to teach piece of it, but it is linked to the how students learn to read. Well, I'll start with the how students learn to read part. For a long time in my own thinking, I really believe that kids learn to read using rules. But what I came to understand after sort of diving into these called connectionist models of reading is that when we read words, like, we don't break it into letter sounds. When we see the word cat, it's not that we see k and t. We see the k and the at. We all see the k and the a. And so we also know that the k is at the beginning and the t is at the end. And so when you think about a word in that way, when we see it, we are not just using one kind of information. We're using lots of different kinds of information at the same time. And so this paper is about when we then teach kids, should we be teaching them using a rule, or is that not a really good idea when we think about the fact that that's not exactly how reading works? But on the teaching side, there are some things that work pretty much all the time. So, there are not many words where the M doesn't say except for like in, a word that has an MB. There are not any words, I think OA is another one that's almost completely consistent, and EE. So there are patterns in the language you can rely on, and it's helpful for beginning readers to learn about those patterns. But there's a limit, and I think the limit is about when do we rely on a pattern and when do we let students use their experience and use some guidance to figure out words? Do we always have to give them an exact rule, or are there other ways that we can teach kids to read these words that is systematic? It's not you just sort of, wild away, figure it out for yourself, but we may not need to be as prescriptive as we sometimes are because reading doesn't work exactly in this prescriptive kind of way.
So is the idea that it's instead of saying this is the rule, follow this rule, it's pay attention to these patterns, and it's that these patterns are usually happening and they're usually kind of firing in your brain?
Yeah, so what sort of data indicate kind of writ large about sort of how people read is that it turns out that we think about vowels and consonants differently. It appears in some research that people actually block words into pieces based on vowel letters, actually, which means that people get really confused with a word like chaos because there's the A and the O and they don't really know what to do with it. It actually takes them longer to recognize that those are two separate parts, even though it wouldn't form a sound on its own. And so what is tricky is that students need to understand something about the system, but they don't need to understand, they need to understand something about the vowels and the consonants, but they don't need to understand necessarily this really detailed knowledge. What they could know is that if there are vowels, that every syllable has a vowel, and then that you have to break the word into parts that make sense, or that I sometimes say look okay, right? So if you break the word describe, you have the DE part and the scribe part. Let's leave the E at the end off the problem for a second. And you could break it D-E-S-C-R, but then there's no syllable in English that really ends with an R like that, with a C before it. And so that wouldn't make sense. And so what you can teach students to do is to break words into parts that look okay and each have a vowel in them. And if you teach kids that, then it doesn't require you necessarily to have a rule, like break it after the first vowel and so on. You can give students this idea that you need to break a word into parts, but you might not need to give them this sort of it has to be a long vowel here and a short vowel here. Certainly they need to know that there are long vowels and short vowels, but it may not be necessary for us to teach, the long vowel, this exact rule.
And that makes a lot of sense to me. It talks about word reading as kind of a higher level problem solving feature where you can figure it out in a way that makes sense. And it also reminds me a lot of math where I don't want to just follow the rule. I want to understand why the rule is there and how it works. So, it makes me sort of think about just being a word solver versus just a memorizer.
Yeah, I think that's really key. And for kids to know the simplest possible ways to solve words. Because one of the things that's challenging about a syllable division process, if you teach it the way it is described in a lot of curricula, it's a really complex multi-step process. In the paper, there is a 5-column description of how this works, right? And that's really challenging that we would need so many steps to do it. When kids come to a word in text, are they going to go through this process? And if they did go through this process, is it going to be useful to them so that they'll be able to maintain comprehension? If we give them something simpler, that's faster, that they can still solve a word, but they can do it quickly, then that seems better to me because then they don't have to spend so much time on just the one word. They can get it using their simple strategy and move right on.
I love it. But so other things I still hear from you is it's still systematic And it still involves a lot of practice, a lot of actual reading of words.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's one advantage to the sort of focusing less on these rules and focusing more on sort of opportunities to, like you said, practice, is that kids just see more words. If you teach kids this division process, it might take a minute for them to do it. And in a minute, they could have read like 10 words. And if they didn't get it right, you could give them corrective feedback so they get it right the next time. But if you are going into this, this rule piece, you're losing a lot of time that could otherwise be spent practicing. And practice time is critical. That's another thing I've learned from these connectionist models, is that the way that we learn to read is by our brain sort of every time we read a word and we make a mistake and someone says what the word is supposed to be, we correct that. And we adjust in our brain the way that the letter sounds ought to be. And again, it's not just one kind of letter sounds, all kinds at the same time. So I've learned that that's why practice is so important, because the more we do that, the more we sort of build up this ability to work with words really effectively. And again, but we need some strategy sometimes, but they can be simple so you can maximize that practice.
Cool. So, and just because you haven't said it and I've read your paper, what your paper also found was that some rules work. I think a certain rule was pretty consistent in the English language, but then there was a rule that just worked like 50% of the time.
Yeah. So there are these two rules for the uninitiated. I'll just try to describe it briefly. There are rules about when you have vowel letters and then consonant letters, another vowel letter. How do you pronounce the first vowel, right? Because that's kind of a way into the word, is that how do you say that first vowel? There are two. There's the vowel, consonant vowel, like in rabbit. Okay, so you have two B's in between the A and the I. And the rule is you break the word between the two B's, or whatever it is. If it's, I can't think of another example, master or something, you break between the S and the T. And when the vowel in the first syllable isn't at the end, it says the short sound. People call that sometimes a closed syllable. And that works a lot. So that works like 85% of the time. And depending on how you sort of gauge it, can work up to like 95% of the time. So you can rely on that pattern. The trickier one is the VCV rule. And the rule there is that when you have a pattern like in tiger, where you have an I and a G and an E, you break the word after the first vowel, and the vowel says it's long sound. So in tiger, the I says I, and that's the word. So that seems like a really good idea. And I've actually seen it shown in a lot of places. It's like 75% accurate. And actually, in the Common Core standards, I think they say it's like 75% accurate. I don't know where they got that information. I'm not saying that they didn't think it through, but that is not what I found. And yeah, so some of these patterns, the VCV pattern, works close to 50% of the time. And with the letter E, it's actually more common for it not to work. So, right? And
no wonder kids are confused.
Yeah, exactly. Because a lot of times the E says a schwa sound. So that's the other problem. And sometimes in all long words, multi-polysyllabic words, one of the vowels will just say kind of an ish sound, like in about. Almost every word is going to do that because because of the way English works, we always shorten things. So if you add those in, these rules don't work very well at all. The vowel, consonant vowel still works pretty well, but the vowel, consonant vowel gets all mixed up. And a lot of times the vowels will say the schwa sound, that kind of sound, and that messes everything up. And so, kids trying to say something with the long sound, they can try it and it doesn't sound right. And it's because it wasn't even a short sound, it was a schwa sound.
So let's move into teachers. So what does this mean for teachers? What should teachers do tomorrow based off of your study?
Yeah, so one thing is to teach that every syllable has at least one vowel. So it's called Ishalav. This was Rolando O'Connor and her colleagues came up with this Bridges program. In the Bridges program, they came up with this idea, this principle that every syllable has at least one vowel. And that's kind of that bedrock idea I said, that that's the way English works. You can break it into parts by the vowel letters, actually, even. And so if you do that to start, then you can use that information that the syllable parts have to look okay, if they can't end with something weird. And then students can know that the vowels can say the long sound and the short sound, and maybe the schwa sound. The data on the schwa sound are not clear, so I'm not going to advocate that one way or the other, but you want to teach students that there's a long sound and short sound. And then there are patterns about whether the vowels at the end or in the middle of a syllable. I'm not sure how useful those are, but if you know that if you break the word rabbit into R-A-B, and you know that the A could say the long sound or the short sound, you say rab, and then you say bit, and that's rat, you say put together, sound out rabbit, then you know that you were able to use that pattern. With tiger, you could break it after the G and you don't know, does it say the I sound or the I sound? You can try it one way. If that doesn't work, you can try it the other way. And so if you teach students that they have the ishalab, the parts have to look okay, and then they know different pronunciations for the vowel letters, then they have access to that. The other big piece is that, and I know Amanda knows this because this is what Amanda studies, is that words are divided into morphemes, right? Meaning parts. And the cool thing about morphemes is that they help you in two ways. One is that they're big chunks of a word, like T-I-O-N gives you 4 letters at one go. So if you can see T-I-O-N is shun, then like, you know, in a word like nation, you've got most of the problem solved, right? The second advantage is they are related to meaning, right? So they give you a little bit of information about how word meanings work. And what's really exciting is you can teach kids to break words using these morpheme units because they're bigger, and they make it easier for kids to break a word into parts. You know, there's like, there's this word pseudo-hypoparathyroidism, which is really long, but it only has like 6, it has a bunch of letters. I think it's like 22 letters, but it only has 6 morphemes in it. Whereas this Hawaiian word for fish, which is humu, humu, nuku, nuku, apua'a, is really tough because there's no morphemes. So you literally have to go letter sound by letter sound. So the morphemes kind of help you break up words into these bigger chunks, so it's easier to read the parts. And they have the second benefit of they get you information about the meaning. And as your work has shown, a lot of other people's work has shown, is morphemes are actually incredibly useful, not just for reading the words, but actually for building vocabulary and reading comprehension skills. So if that's going to give you kind of the twofer, you know, like it's a great idea to use those as units, and you get sort of a multi-piece bang for the buck.
So I'm taking away from you that as teachers, we should try to get them to read these big morpheme units if possible, but we also should really get these big principles that each syllable is a vowel, and that once you kind of break the word into the syllables with the vowels, you can then know that the syllable is either going to be short or long or the schwa sound, and so they can take a problem-solving approach to figuring that word out, because ultimately the word's supposed to sound like something they know, which also reminds me that at the same time as a teacher, I'm building vocabulary knowledge so that they can also be recognizing all these words that they're sounding out.
Totally. And that actually gets to another point I don't think I make in the paper, which is I really encourage people not to use super rare words in instruction. There was one program that I taught where the word pipkin was in there, and it was like on the real word page. And it's like an old-fashioned earthenware pot from like the Stone Age, right? Nobody knows what this is. It's not really a real word. And so I really encourage people, a big part of reading a word correctly is you sound it out, and even when you sound out a word like rabbit, the word is not rabbit, right? Rabbit. It's rabbit, which is sort of like a mesh of these, and the I doesn't exactly say the I sound even. And so we need to take what we sort of sound out and we need to put it together in a slightly different way. And so having the ability to sort of transform is going to be really important too. And so we need to make sure students are able to do that too.
All right, cool. Well, we are kind of taking up a lot of time because I got so interested in that. What does your study say for principals and policymakers? What's the big picture view of this?
I mean, it's sort of a little thing, so I'm not sure. I guess I would say that when you are trying to determine if a program is aligned with the science of reading, it doesn't need to include like syllable division rules necessarily if it has some principles for helping kids break words into part. And I will not say the name of a program because this is research, but there are a couple programs that I find really useful and that have some decent data that don't have rules like that built into them. They have these quick problem solving strategies. And so what you want to look for is a program that includes really critical pieces that we know about what's critical, like teaching kids some basic letter sound correspondences and a variety of other things I'm not going to go into. But look at a program and evaluate it not based on whether or not it does syllable division. That doesn't need to be there in order for a program to be effective.
That's important. As a parent, any thoughts about what this means?
Yeah, so especially parents of kids with dyslexia and other reading difficulties, they've heard a lot about certain programs, and they sometimes will actually, I've worked with a lot of district administrators for special education where parents will demand certain programs from them because they've heard like this is the best thing. And a lot of those programs have in them this syllable division kind of piece. And they may have heard from their neighbors, oh, my kid does this thing with the syllable division and so on. I think the thing for parents is that one strategy is not the only thing to do, and that not one program is going to solve all the problems. If a program does some explicit systematic teaching about the letter sound system, that is key. It doesn't necessarily have to be like the ones that everybody knows about. There are some good things out there. You just need to do some research about that. And talk with the administrators at the school and the district. You don't have to sort of start with like, I know this is the right thing. You may have heard about that, but some schools are doing a great job of figuring out what to teach. And so just have an open mind about that when you go to a district.
And now we're hanging out in COVID times. A lot of virtual instruction, a lot of social distance instruction. What does your study mean for that?
Well, I wrote this study before COVID, so I don't, I think that in this time, the flexible strategies are both good and bad given the modality. So, teaching rules is a little bit easier than a lot of other things in COVID time when you sort of are trying to teach things directly. And so you might be, sort of think about, like, well, I can teach this rule and so on. And it might be a little trickier to get kids to kind of do the solving thing and so on. But I would say, really try to emphasize that with a lot of practice. And I would say
that's one thing that I'm taking away for COVID is that like their practice matters. So the kids need to be reading words and
stories. Then
giving them these approaches with problem solving to say like, all right, here's some general rules, aka vowels and a syllable, but let's figure this out. And here's how you can figure it out. And here's a lot of practice to do so.
Yeah, that's critical. I would also say this is sort of a general thing. Give your kids a clear space to work. I think part of reading is a really effort intensive process. And so it's helpful not to have a lot of stuff besides the books and the laptop in front of you. So just, you want it to be a welcoming space, but you want to have your kid in a spot where they won't be distracted by the wider environment. That'll help them get in the practice. That's just a broad thing, but something that I think parents may not know.
Very cool. All right. So this was super interesting. As we're kind of leaving it, any like big ideas that you want us to definitely take with us?
Yeah, I think the big thing is in the broader community, I think things are polarized. This is true of the world, but in even reading research, things are pretty polarized and people have kind of taken on these really strong views and are they have trouble compromising. They have trouble kind of seeing that there are other ways to think about it. It's kind of dogmatic. And I just want to say, like, I really tried with this work to change my own thinking. I started off thinking one thing about this, and I've evolved in my thinking because I thought about the data. And so I think it's, I would like to encourage the community to take be more willing to challenge people's own perspectives so that we can move the field forward. And that in truth, like there are points of, symbiosis across different ways of thinking about this. And if we can sort of take a step back and exploit those together, I think we could get somewhere. I don't think that's just kumbaya. I think that's actually true. And I think that this paper is a little example of how you can sort of start to challenge your own thinking and move in that direction.
I love that. I mean, you started off this saying that when you learned about this, you were psyched. You were like, it's the magic bullet. We're gonna solve all the problems. But then as you thought about the nuance, it got more complex. And so you changed your own thinking, and you came up with an alternative way of exploring it and some alternative ways of teaching it as well. And so I think that's the power. I mean, that's certainly why we did this special issue. So
yeah, I'm really glad that you all did. I think it's an important contribution to the field. So thank you for all the hard work that you and Bob Jimenez did. It's really wonderful.
Very cool. Well, thanks so much for being with us, Devin. I always enjoy chatting with you. And again, if you want to read Devin's article, it's entitled, Does English Have Useful Syllable Division Patterns, by Devin Kearns. Thanks, Devin.
All right. Thanks, Amanda. Great to see you.
Great
Bye,
to
everyone.
see you. Take care.